Hello, in these extraordinary circumstances, I'm afraid that I'm not in Amherst where I ought to be today and tomorrow and the day after. I'm having to meet with you virtually, and I hope we're going to travel together through the streets of Barcelona to New York as I talk about two translation projects, one that has finished and published, Barcelona Tales, published by Oxford University Press, and L'Anada Balada, a transatlantic gaze, that will be published in the fall by the Carnegie Mellon University Press. But let's start with the 23rd of April, Sant Jordi. And Miquel Molina has a story called The Three Steps, which I use in Barcelona Tales. And he writes of a young man who's been to university, has been studying abroad, and has come back to Barcelona. And he goes to visit some of his old haunts. And he goes up the Monte Pelado in Carmel district in search of three stone steps that he remembers on the top of this bare hill, and he finds them, and the place is kind of thronging with tourists and joggers, and he decides to walk back down to the centre of Barcelona where Sant Jordi is in full swing. And he has a novel under his arm, which is a novel that has three steps in it. There are young kids in the Carmel district who kind of meet around these three steps. And he wants to go and find the author of that novel, which is one of his favourite novels. And it seems as if it may be a novel by the writer Juan Marcé. So it's a lovely walk. If you go from the top of Barcelona down to the centre, it takes about 45 minutes. It's a pleasant walk, and you can avoid most of the busiest streets. And you often have on the horizon the vista of the sea. And he arrives in the Passeig de Gràcia, and he joins a queue to meet this author, and he says, "I walked along gripping my cell phone in my trouser pocket and staring at the to and fro of books and roses. In a couple of hours walking in the centre would be a real headache. Luckily the queue wasn't too long. The writers had only set up behind parapets of books a few minutes ago. Some were busy talking among themselves. Barely 20 readers were queuing in front of mine. Most carried his latest title for him to sign. To whom should I dedicate it? To my girlfriend Elizabeth. In Catalan or Spanish? I watched the unsteady hand of someone who had stopped using a pen many years ago. I think he responded to my question when he added the date under his signature. It's not real. Everything is invented, including the steps. It's a novel." Now, how did I get this story, and how did I go about choosing the stories? Well, I'd already had experience of anthologizing. In the mid-90s, I put together an anthology of Cuban stories called The Voice of the Turtle. And at the turn of the century, I did an anthology which was a literary traveller's guide to Spain, which I did with Lisa Dillman. And I think in both of those anthologies, the idea was to create a kind of complex vision of those societies and worlds, and not to try and avoid the kind of stereotypical visions of Spain and of Cuba. And that's really what I wanted to do with Barcelona Tales. And it came to me out of a conversation with a friend and brilliant translator, Margaret Jill Costa. She was telling me about a project of hers, Madrid Tales, that had come out in a series that Oxford University Press have called City Tales. And this project was started by Helen Constantine, who's the general editor, with her book of Paris Tales. So I kind of got in contact with Helen and said, "What's the possibility?" And she said, "Yes, it's a good idea." And so I had to write a proposal, and that had to go through the kind of process at OUP. But anyway, eventually I got the contract, and I was already working on the selection, and I wrote to agents. I spent some time in the National Library of Catalonia in Barcelona, looking at books of short stories by all kinds of writers, some I'd never read before. I talked to friends, and gradually the book came together. And the story, for instance, by Miquel Molina is unpublished. He wrote it in Spanish, and it's unpublished. So it's a kind of first publication of that story. I wanted to show Barcelona as a historic city. I wanted to show some of the way that it had changed from the end of the 19th century to the present day. I wanted to reflect in the anthology some of my own experiences of Barcelona. I first went to Barcelona in the mid-60s. I went there to do research on the working class movements in the 19th century, and then I went there to help form a political party that was opposed to Franco in 1968. I started to learn Catalan in the 1970s, thinking that I would go and live in Barcelona for a year, but that never came off. And then I eventually did go to live in Barcelona in 2003 with my now wife, Teresa Solana. So I'd seen Barcelona under the Franco dictatorship when it was a very kind of grey, gloomy place. The buildings, for instance, of Gaudí were kind of dirty. It was a city that had the feel of an occupied city. Now Barcelona in the Middle Ages was a thriving maritime city, one of the most important ports in the Mediterranean. And I decided to start with an extract from the end of the second part of Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote, because if you remember, Sancho and Don Quixote go to Barcelona, and you have that sense of a city with bustle, wealth, and the two characters arrive there, and this is the second part of the Quixote, published in 1615, 10 years after the first, and they are celebrities. Everybody has read the first part, and so they don't walk the streets alone. They in fact walk the streets always surrounded by crowds. And they come from La Mancha in central Spain, and they'd never seen the sea before. They'd never seen ships before. And there was also a visit to a print shop, a discussion about translation and writing. And I'm going to read a short passage. They're staying with Don Antonio, who is a kind of a well-off man who's well established in Barcelona, and he takes them down to the seafront to see the ships and to actually go on board a ship, which is one of 4 ships that is guarding the port against possibility of incursions by pirates from North Africa. And when they board the ship, they're cheered, and this is what happens. Bowled over by such praise, Don Quixote replied with equal grace. They all then walked onto the ornate poop deck and sat on the bulwark benches. The boatswain strode down the gangway, and a blast from his whistle signalled to the slaves to strip off their rags, which they did in a flash. Sancho was shocked by the sight of all their naked flesh, and even more so when he saw the awnings drop so fast he thought an army of devils must be at work. But that was pancakes soaked in honey compared to what I'll tell you now. Sancho was perched on the seat next to the overseer on the right, who'd received his orders what to do. He grabbed Sancho, lifted him upon his arms, and when the slaves were standing ready, sent him spinning across their arms from bench to bench, down his side, so fast poor Sancho shut his eyes tight, no doubt reckoning that those same devils were back, who wouldn't stop until they had whizzed him back up the left side and plonked him in the poop. Panting and sweating like a pig, the poor tyke was tottering, quite unable to imagine what had happened. I like the cartoonish nature of that of the Quixote. The way that they kind of toss him around as if it was almost like a Disney cartoon. But also there is the visceral reaction of Sancho to seeing slaves, the galley slaves, and the way they strip off their clothes before they set to rowing to take the boat out to sea. Now, from there, the following story, Transplantat, also has the theme of the kind of movement from the countryside into the big city. It's a story by Narcís Oller, which was published in 1898, and it's called Transplanted, and it's about this baker from a small village who goes to Barcelona because his wife has died. He's getting on, and he wants to be with his son, who has set up this kind of flash barber shop on the Rambla, and is having great success in the press and everywhere, because he's bought all the latest equipment, all the latest perfumes and creams and stuff from England, and so he goes to live with his son. And to begin with, he's dazzled by the lights and by the bustle. But finally, he becomes depressed because all this movement, there are all these people, he can make no connections with them, and he begins to feel nostalgic for the village where he knew everybody and was respected. And he walks down to the railway station where the train comes, sometimes with people from his village. Daniel's gaze slid along the rails like the gaze of an exile contemplating a river that finds its source in his distant land. The poor man wept. He couldn't imagine why a path that one day had brought so much pleasure could now so depress him. It demonstrated yet again the truth of the poet. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. All at once, Daniel sprang to his feet and strode towards the hairdressing salon, looking animated, a feeling he'd not had in a long time. "Thanks to be God, you look so happy," said his son. "You look like a new man. What's made you so cheerful all of a sudden?" "I think I've identified my sickness and found my cure. I'm missing the village. I'm going home tomorrow." It's a melancholy story. And of course, often we think of the move from the countryside to the city and all the attractions of the city, and we forget that there are those that go back, that can't adapt to life in the city. And then I want to talk about a writer called César August Jordana. He was a socialist intellectual and writer, and somebody who kind of promoted the use of Catalan in the 1930s, worked with the Generalitat's linguistic department, And he was a translator. He was the first translator of D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. He translated also plays by Shakespeare, Aldous Huxley. But then at the end of the Civil War, he had to go into exile. He went to Santiago de Chile and then ended up in Buenos Aires, where he wrote his masterpiece, El Món de Joan Ferrer, in Catalan in Buenos Aires. In 1938, he wrote a series of short sketches or vignettes of life in Barcelona at the time. And of course, in 1938, there were a series of bombing raids over Barcelona. Bombing raids where hundreds, if not thousands, of people were killed, and he writes these vignettes, which were published in a literary magazine that was published in Gracia, and they are humorous at times. They're modernist in tone. They're not realist. They're unusual in that respect, and that's another aspect to the book. I wanted to reflect a kind of series of styles of different kinds of writing about Barcelona, and I chose three vignettes. One is of two lovers under a sky that's haunted by aeroplanes. Another is set in a hospital, and the third one is in a bar where there's very little to drink and very little to eat, but there's a kind of spirit of humour. Ersatz, the great word of our time. It's not bad at all. This is the drink that they're having to drink. It goes with black olives. The two bitter notes play sweetly on the tongue, slip smoothly down the gullet. Will they come? And so what if they do? The girl from Malaga says she's so scared when she hears the sirens. A soldier laughs, and her sad ballad eyes suddenly sparkle and smile. The barman grins enigmatically, and his philosophical gaze prowls through the air, follows the flight of a fly, focuses beneath his wrinkled brow. At last he spots me. More coffee? Yes, please. A stretch. And obviously after the Civil War, life in Barcelona was very hard. There was a lot of repression. The language was repressed. There was not very much food. But gradually, kind of through the 1950s, the city picks up. There's migration from the south, and later on that becomes migration from all over the North Africa, France, or from all over the world. In fact, Barcelona becomes a fully cosmopolitan city, and I have several stories that kind of reflect the cosmopolitan nature of the modern city of Barcelona. There's a story, for instance, by Najat El-Hashmi called The Sound of Keys, which is about two sisters in a family that have come from migrated from Morocco, and the family lives in a rather nondescript small town outside of Barcelona, and the two sisters, who are the kind of older siblings in the family, get bored. They're bored, and they're also fed up of being drudges, having to wash and pick up the dirty clothing of their brothers and so on. And they decide to venture out, and they go to Barcelona. They rent a flat there and begin to explore different aspects of life in the city. Walks. walks, non-stop walks, along the city's endless streets. Barcelona was endless, and that's what we most liked about it. We went down as far as Las Glorias, we crossed over to Poblenou, and from there took any street that led to the sea, not knowing we would reach the sea, not knowing a thing. We were like country bumpkins, gawping at everything. We'd been to Barcelona before, but only for specific reasons. For years, the whole family had come by train to sort out papers. My sister and I found it embarrassing when we all got on the train. We were so many brothers and sisters, so many children. The two youngest still quarrelled and mother sometimes slapped them. And in the metro she'd shout, "Hey, you be careful," all the time, and hold out her arms in front of us so we didn't fall on the tracks. Our mother was a mother hen. Father was quieter and always chewed something. Whatever did he chew? I don't know why we're so embarrassed. Perhaps because we were such a raggle-taggle, with so many of us. Our parents were fat. Father had a paunch. Mother was one huge bulk. 7 pregnancies. And then there's a story by Teresa Solana about dead bodies that are found in the basement of the Mercat del Ninot when it was being refurbished, to give some idea of the markets of Barcelona, which are such important centres of life, unimaginable in a city, for instance, in the UK or in the United States. Barcelonans like to shop in these big markets to buy fresh food, fish, meat, and so on, and they don't rely so much as on supermarkets or hypermarkets. Not yet, anyway. I wanted also to reflect on to have moments reflected in the book that are moments of kind of everyday moments when people get on the underground or get a taxi or move house. And I chose a story by Jorge Carrion, which is from a wonderful book he wrote about the passageways and arcades in Barcelona. I chose this story, which is called Julio the Parrot and the Taxi Driver. But basically, the narrator he's taking the cat, Julio, on a taxi to the new flat where the family is going to live. And he has a conversation with the taxi driver, as you do all the time in Barcelona. Often these conversations are about Real Madrid, Barcelona, Barça, they're about football or about politics. But this one isn't. It's about parrots, because the taxi driver has a parrot and it's obviously the pride of his life. And so he kind of goes on about this parrot. And he says, "Not long ago, they found Churchill's parrot alive, and he's like 104 years old. That's very unusual because its owner died like 50 years ago. Her name is Charlie, though she's female. Charlie's very famous in the world of parrots, you know, in parrot mythology." "You don't say?" "Yes, because she learned lots of swear words against Hitler and against Nazis in general. But she doesn't talk now, though she does dance and so on, but she doesn't talk anymore. They go dumb with age." "Not like taxi drivers?" "No, you must be kidding. It's the opposite with us. The older we get, the more we like to chatter. By the way, don't you want to know how much Lola costs? It's the first time a customer hasn't asked me." I want to talk about the other translation project, which is a biography by Juan Francisco de Dios Hernández, Leonardo Balada, A Transatlantic Gaze. How did I come about this project? Well, again, it was through a translator friend This time a North American translator called Carol Meyer, who is a very, very dear friend. She was approached by Joan and Leonardo Balada to see whether she would be interested in translating the biography. And she didn't have time. She was involved in other projects, translating Maria Zambrano and Rosa Chasel. And so she kind of contacted me and asked me whether I was interested. And I was. I found the book very... Well, I learned a lot reading the book about the relationship between Barcelona and this musician Leonardo Balada, who I'd never heard of at that stage. Anyway, kind of 2 years went by and I never heard anything. And then Leonardo's wife, Joan Balada, got in contact with me and said that it was now going ahead. They got funds from the university, the Carnegie Mellon University, to kind of pay for the translation, and could I kind of fit it into my schedule, and I did, and the book it will be published in the fall, and this is a story that starts in Barcelona, in a flat near the Plaza de la Universitat, where Balada's family had lived. His father was a tailor, and he was a tailor who'd been educated in the Catalan anarchist tradition. He'd been a pupil at Francesc Ferrer's Escola Moderna, and he brought up his children with the philosophy of the Escola Moderna, with that anarchist philosophy. And unfortunately, his workshop was burnt down, and so the family lost a lot of money. They weren't insured, and they had to move out of the centre of Barcelona to a kind of neighbouring town, Sant Just, almost a suburb of Barcelona. And when Leonardo he was going to school, he was fortunate, because in Sant Just his father took him along to the local school, and of course we're talking about, again, it's the Franco dictatorship, and the headmistress interviewed Leonardo, and she said, well, he's a very bright lad, and really he wouldn't kind of fit in the boys' class, in the boys' school. He really ought to go into a class at the girls' school, because they're more advanced. Remember that under Franco, education was strictly segregated. Boys and girls were educated separately. So this was quite kind of remarkable. And Leonardo ended up going through that phase of his schooling as the only boy in a class of girls. Leonardo's high school education was also remarkable in that it mostly took place in the house of his former headmistress, who was a Republican and communist. And when they finished their lessons, Leonardo and some of the other students would stay on in the house, and I'll just read a bit from the biography about that. After passing his final exam, Nardo had access to a much greater level of intellectual and ethical knowledge than he could ever have imagined. Classes were taught in Catalan, a language that was officially banned and non-existent in the Francoist educational system, and that gave a sharp clandestine edge to his liberal education. Occasionally, individuals would visit the teacher's house at night and begin to speak about the political situation in the country. Those meetings charted an unambiguous ideological map in the young student's mind. People entered the house one at a time, at 10-minute intervals, so as not to attract attention, given that any kind of meeting was illegal. Once inside, a dissident individual would employ words erased from dictionaries in those years: class struggle, freedom, dictatorship, or democracy. Inspired by their rhetoric, on their way home after clandestine meetings, Nardo and his friends played out their individual resistance to the regime via acts of street vandalism. Nardo plucked up courage and wrote "Visca Catalunya Lliure" on the side of the house of Sant Just's mayor. So Leonardo continued to live with his family, grandmother, in Sant Just. He developed his skills as a musician, found that he liked composing, began to go to the conservatory in Barcelona. Out of this experience, a different life was emerging to the one that he had envisaged, which would be to follow in the footsteps of his father as a tailor, because he helped all the time in his father in his work, and this musical future was interrupted by a letter that came through the post, which was calling him up for military conscription. Still in civilian gear, they had to stand to attention, listen to the roll call, and have their first taste of military discipline. Then came the great moment of his fictitious baptism. Palada Nardo. Present. What fucking kind of name is that? Who's that individual? That's me, sir. Don't done well, sir, me. Captain. Yes, Captain. Come on then. Tell me what kind of name that is. Nardo. That's a mistake, isn't it? No Spaniard in the Catholic country of ours can possibly be called that. Don't you mean Leonardo? And understanding that there was a very delicate moment that could shape the months ahead among those crags, he bit his lip and replied, "That's right, sir. I mean Captain Leonardo." "That's more like it. No Nardo, no spikenard. Let's try again. Balada Leonardo." Of course, Leonardo's anarchist parents had given him the name of Nardo, not the name of a flower, not the name of a Catholic saint. And that is what's led to this rebaptism, which took place in a military context. So hence, we now know Nardo as Leonardo. After his military conscription was over, he was able to return to Sant Just, resume his musical activities, and he got the scholarship to go to New York in 1956 to study music, and he went off to New York and really never came back to live in Catalonia. He came back to see his family. He came back on with various musical commitments, but his future life was in the United States. And in New York in the mid-50s, there was a thriving cultural life centered around the Hispanic community, with South Latin Americans, exiled Spaniards from Francoism, and he began to mix in these circles and find some small kind of opportunities to work for cultural magazines like Temas, and he interviewed a number of, for instance, Alicia Alonso, the Cuban ballet dancer and teacher. He played with the flamenco group. He got to know Salvador Dali and interviewed him twice for magazines. And then that kind of contact with Dali developed into something more substantial, and he began to collaborate on artistic projects with Dali. And I'm going to read a short description of a video that he was involved in making. Obviously, having Dali at hand was an opportunity to participate in an extraordinary learning experience. His previously one-sided relationship with the painter soon became a creative dialogue. The idea of collaborating cropped up one afternoon. It was 1960. Dali was working on the idea of a 20-minute short, with a happening that was a sort of satire of Piet Mondrian. Dali's destructive penchant went down well in the United States. Apparently only geniuses were allowed to be iconoclastic, and then only when they confessed to being half mad. Although it was clear that Dali was no madman, he loved to act up, and consequently the film was an act of creative madness. The tape is now considered to be one of the first historical examples of video art. The plot was in itself an authentic surrealist painting. The mocking of Mondrian was enacted by Dali, painting pigs, 4 real pigs that were transported from the neighbouring state of Pennsylvania, and painting popcorn and even a nude model. Dali appeared in the film with 2 models, Leslie Crane and Miriam Dekova. Only a few memories rehearsed by participants in the venture kept alive the myth of a film nobody had seen, but which everybody had heard about. Ballada was involved in another creative collaboration with Dali. The idea was that Ballada should be responsible for the soundtrack, or rather the music, to be heard at a specific moment in the movie. Dali wanted Ballada to compose a score inspired by one of his drawings. After seeing the short, we deduced that Ballada's presence was probably a requisite imposed by Dali, since the short lacks dramatic continuity, and his contribution complements the film's thesis, even if it is quite tokenistic. Ballada was asked to put music to the concept, and that was a real challenge when it was an exercise in not particularly subtle aesthetic leg pulling. A work with lines and dots by Dali himself had brushstrokes that could very well have suggested musical notation, or at least shapes that appeared to, and that as such could be scattered over a Dalinian horizon. Suddenly, the great idea came. Ballada asked for a photo of the work, then put his staves over the drawing and began to arrange the notes as a reference point for his later improvisation for piano. The work was an essay in the purest avant-garde and totally deserved the name it was given, Chaos and Creation. And he got various kind of temporary jobs playing organ in Catholic churches, and then work at teaching Spanish at the United Nations School and another school, and eventually secured a lectureship teaching music at the Carnegie Mellon University, where he still works as an emeritus professor. And throughout his subsequent life, he was involved in projects with Andres Segovia, Narciso Yepes, Camilo José Cela, many Fernando Arrabal, many leading figures in the Hispanic cultural world. The biography, Juan Francisco de Dios Hernández, has spent hours in conversation with Leonardo as part of the process of writing the biography, and he kind of describes the whole development of his work. And so this was a translation project that for me was a challenge in that it was a musical world I was unfamiliar with. There are descriptions of composition and a kind of a technical language that, not being at all a player of instruments or a reader of music even, were new to me, and so that was something I had to research. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our whistle-stop tour of Barcelona and Barcelona in New York, courtesy of Barcelona Tales and the biography of Leonardo Balada. I'm confined to a house. I can walk around my garden, and there's a meadow, fortunately, at the back of the garden where I can walk as well. But I miss the streets, walking through the streets, shopping, kind of the daily things that we take for granted. And I'm sure you're in the same boat, as it were. At least we can travel through our reading, through our imagination. And I love waking up in the morning and thinking, well, today I'm going to spend the morning with Balzac. I'm translating a novel by Balzac. I'm translating a novel by Najat al-Hashmi. I'm translating an essay by Jorge Carrion on bookshops in the time of the coronavirus. And it's a real pleasure to be kind of drawn into these different worlds and translate them into English. And at the same time, I'm reading other books, thinking about new projects. And I hope that you're going to take some advantage of this, of some of the time that you have cooped up at home to have a go at translating and take on some projects that you might have not envisaged before.